Most people will assume Christianity spread because of Paul, but that's not actually what Luke reveals in the book of Acts. See, long before Paul began his traveling missionary work, long before his letters, long before any theology debates, something else happened first. See, there was a small group of ordinary believers, unnamed, unknown, and they carry the message of Jesus northwards, not to Rome or to Athens, but to a city most Bible readers barely notice. That city? Antioch. And in that city, everything changed. Because Antioch became the first place the Jesus movement truly learned how to live outside of Jerusalem. So let's go back to Jerusalem around CE 30 to 33. The movement was entirely Jewish, a Jewish renewal group, if you like. You know, they were still temple attending, still Torah observant, still nationally focused. And in Acts chapter 2, right through to chapter 5, shows this group to be engaged in daily temple prayers. Sacrifices were continuing. There was no Gentile mission, no separation from Judaism. They actually didn't think they had started a new religion. They believed they were the faithful Israel. Their leadership structure, well, it was James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, John, the 12 apostles. This was all Jerusalem based, all Torah observant Jews. There was no cultural sort of change yet required, so there was no tension within them at this stage. They were all Jews. Then came a shock and a scattering around CE 33 to 35. See, Stephen had just been killed. He was the first martyr, and persecution broke out all around Judea. Acts informs us at chapter 8 and verse 1. See, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered. Look carefully. Who were scattered? Not the apostles, just the ordinary believers. The ones who were without titles or without any real recognition. These were the ones who carried the message forward. Sometimes it's not the leaders who spread the movement or a movement. It's the scattered, the displaced, the refugees, if you like. And where did they travel? Well, they traveled north from Jerusalem through Phoenicia, across into Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, back onto the mainland, until they reached Antioch. But here we need to slow down a bit. See, because Antioch wasn't just another town. It was huge. The third largest city in the Roman Empire. See, after Rome and Alexandria in Egypt. Population, about 500,000 people. Trade routes intersected there from east and west. Roman soldiers were everywhere. The language was Greek, and the culture, well, it was mainly Syrian. And it had a large Jewish population. So if Jerusalem was considered religious, Antioch was international. It was busy, mixed, messy, if you like, cosmopolitan. So the message of Jesus could actually survive there in Antioch. Well, it could survive anywhere. It helps us really to picture Antioch properly. See, this wasn't just a dusty provincial town. No, it was a Roman metropolis. Colonnaded streets, markets, bathhouses, temples, many temples to different gods, government buildings. Soldiers were everywhere. Merchants, well, speaking half a dozen languages because of the big mix. Ships coming in from the Orontes River loaded with goods from where? From places like Arabia and Persia and Rome. It was noisy, it was crowded, it was restless. So if Jerusalem felt sacred, Antioch, well, it felt very commercial. See, if Jerusalem was about prayer, Antioch, well, it was about business, which made it all the more remarkable that a small group of disciples could plant something there in Antioch that actually lasted. See, at first the believers do what they know. In the book of Acts, they spoke only to the Jews. Acts chapter 11 and verse 19. Meanwhile, those scattered by the persecution that began with Stephen travelled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the message only to Jews. Antioch already had a large Jewish population, tens of thousands perhaps. And wherever Jews lived in the Roman world, what do we see? We see synagogues followed them. They were not just places of worship, but community centers, schools. They were part of charity networks, meeting places for the Jews. If you arrived in a new city as a Jew, the synagogue was usually your first port of call, really your home call. So when these scattered believers arrived in Antioch, that's naturally where they went, to the synagogue. See, they didn't start a new religion because they began inside an existing Jewish space. Teaching about Jesus as Israel's Messiah. And at first nothing looked separate at all. No split had happened yet. It still felt like a renewal movement within Judaism, because it was only later that things changed. And that makes sense. You see, this was still Jewish renewal in movement. But something unexpected happened. Luke says in Acts chapter 11 and verse 20, some of them began speaking to the Greeks also, telling them the good news about the Lord Jesus. Did you notice something important? It wasn't Peter. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't any of the other apostles. Just some of them, these ordinary, unnamed believers, ordinary people. Now, they did something quite natural. They started talking. There was no council decision. There was no theology paper that they went to. No grand sort of strategy. Just simple conversation. And somehow, well, it worked. Chapter 11 and verse 21, Acts. The hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed. See, Antioch had become, well, really the first truly mixed community, Jews and Gentiles, eating together, praying together, learning together. For the first time, the Jesus movement wasn't just a Jewish space, with guests. No, it was shared space. That was new, but also potentially quite explosive. See, when Jerusalem heard about this, they didn't send Peter, they didn't send James, they sent a young fellow named Joseph Barnabas, or named Barnabas. Now, this is fascinating because Barnabas, well, he wasn't a controller. He was actually an encourager, sort of a bridge builder. In Acts chapter 11 and verses 22 and 23, we read, "When news of this reached the ears of the church in Jerusalem, they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he arrived and saw the grace of God, he rejoiced and encouraged them all to abide in the Lord with all their hearts." See, at this point, it would be good to just consider two words, but only briefly for the moment. We'll delve deeper into them in the forthcoming episodes. See, the terms are very simply Christ, from the Greek Christos, and Messiah, from the Hebrew Mashiach. Both literally mean anointed one, referring to someone, well, consecrated with oil, such as a king or a prophet or a priest. However, the canvas on which those words lay was different. And there's another reason Antioch would grow quietly. See, Rome generally tolerated religions. As long as they paid taxes and didn't start riots, Rome mostly left them alone. Judaism was already a legally recognized religion. So at this stage, the Jesus movement, well, it still fitted under that sort of Judaism, the umbrella of Judaism, to the Roman officials, that is. This just looked like another Jewish group. Nothing threatening, nothing political. And this gave that early congregation space, space to meet, to teach, space to grow. Ironically, of course, the empire's indifference became a sort of a protection to them. Now, what did Barnabas do when he arrived? Well, he didn't start shutting anything down. He didn't correct them. He didn't impose Jerusalem's rules on them. He simply rejoiced with them. Now that reveals something about Barnabas' heart. He was known as the son of comfort, so to speak. He recognized God at work even when it looked unfamiliar to him. And then Luke says something we often just sort of rush past. Acts chapter 11, 22 and 23. Now, we just read that. What did he do? He encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. So he did not impose any theology on them. There were no law codes, simply faithfulness. Stay true, stay steady, stay with Jesus' teachings. That was what he was promoting. And sometimes, that's all that leadership really is. Then something even more important happened. See, after a period of time, we don't know exactly how long. The scriptures don't indicate that. But Barnabas, he goes to Tarsus, about 130 miles away, and finds Saul. He brings him back. And as Luke tells us at Acts chapter 11 and verses 25 and 26, then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him back to Antioch. So for a full year, they met together with the church and taught large numbers of people. This is where Saul enters the narrative, but in a very meaningful way. See, the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. So it was a whole year. It was slow. It was deliberate, because there were no revival meetings, no sort of crusades, just teaching, keeping community. And in time, Antioch became a school, sort of a workshop, a place where disciples were actually formed. And here, only here, a new name appears. Christians. Luke says the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. Not in Jerusalem, not named by the apostles, but in Antioch. And probably not even named by themselves. It was a sort of a nickname that was given to them, a label really from outsiders, to those Christ people. And that tells us something, well, subtle but important. See, by this point, they no longer looked, well, just like another Jewish sect. No. Something about them was, in fact, different. Enough to need a new word to describe them, this label, Christians. And at Antioch is where this identity shifts, where the movement becomes sort of visibly distinct from Judaism. And noticed what Antioch became known for. It was not by power, not through authority, but through generosity. That's what this group became known for. See, when famine was predicted, what did they do? They sent a relief all the way down to Judea and Jerusalem. See, this new congregation or church actually supported the old one, not by trying to replace it, but by partnership. Antioch didn't try to compete with Jerusalem. It actually complemented it. Jerusalem, well, it remained the spiritual root. But Antioch really became the sort of a missionary branch, if you like. So we had two centers, but one movement. And Saul assisted Barnabas in that endeavor. Now in Acts chapter 11, 27 to 30, let's read that. In those days, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and predicted through the Spirit that a great famine would sweep across the whole world. And this happened under Claudius. So the disciples, each according to his ability, decided to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. This they did, sending their gifts to the elders with Barnabas and Saul. Barnabas and Saul. This was the support for the mother congregation, if you like. And this really mattered. See, because later in AD 70, or CE 70, well, Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed. Everything collapsed. Now, if the movement was centered only there in Jerusalem, all could have ended. But because Antioch existed, because believers already knew how to live outside the temple arrangement, outside Judea, outside the old structures, if you like, the message of Jesus survived. And Antioch quietly saved the future of the movement. Because it wasn't through theology, it was through community, it was through hospitality, through just ordinary faithfulness. So when we picture the early church, well, we often sort of imagine sermons and miracles, don't we? But Antioch reminds us the real work was slower than that. See, people opened their homes, they shared their meals, teaching week after week, learning how to live together across different cultures, Jew and Greek, rich and poor, local and foreign, and somehow actually staying united. There was no grand strategy, simply faithfulness. And maybe that's how the kingdom usually grows. Not with fanfare and noise, but with steady, ordinary obedience. Antioch didn't look dramatic, but without reading between the lines that Luke narrates, would they have been a story to even tell? Well, actually, yes, there is a further story to tell. Earlier in this episode, I prompted a little sidebar, didn't I? Remember? There were two terms, Christos and Mashiach. We have already read in Acts chapter 11, 25 and 26, that was in Antioch that the first followers of Jesus were first called Christians. So, which became the dominant term defining this Jesus movement? Was it Christos or was it Mashiach? And what role did Saul play in that determination? Now we're going to leave that question sort of hanging, if you like. We're going to leave it hanging until the next episode. So, thank you very much. And as always, see you next time.